Now look at you being brave and asking for feedback on your writing. But now that you have it, what do you do with it? My dear friends, welcome back to the show. I hope you've had a lovely week. Now, beyond the scale of a week, time feels a little made up. So I don't know how long it's actually been since we talked about how to give effective feedback, but I do remember that it was a grand old time. And those guidelines have effectively become enshrined as rules in the writing feedback corner of the Writing with Andrew Discord server. And I've been delighted by the quality of thoughtful feedback that you've all been giving each other over there. It's become a supportive and encouraging place, which is in part a consequence of the rules I set up, but it really says more about you than it does about me. I've been nothing short of impressed with the care that you're taking of each other's work. Because the reality is that it can be a pretty vulnerable thing to share your work with other people, even if it's someone you know and trust. So that sense of vulnerability must only increase if you're sharing your work with relative strangers in a writing class or total strangers on the internet. And that's really just a long way of saying way to go to all of you who have been sharing your work as you strive to improve, whether it's with people you know or in an online setting like the Discord, which is, of course, linked in the description. But asking for feedback is only the first brave step in a much longer process of using that feedback to learn and grow as a writer. We've talked about it before, but inexperienced writers generally don't seek feedback. Intermediate writers seek it, but then just do whatever their readers tell them to do. And experienced writers receive feedback and then make reasoned decisions about whether or not to follow a reader's suggestions. So, in an effort to help you move along that learning curve, I thought we'd talk about how you can start to work more deliberately with the feedback you do get by reliving the feedback and revision process that I worked through long, long ago in poetry school. It's fairly common practice in the Master of Fine Arts world for writing students to gather weekly for a workshop. In my case, it was a class that met for 3 hours once a week, where a member of the faculty and our octet of poets met to read and discuss each other's work. And every so often, a few nonfiction writers would join in on the fun too. And the process was fairly standard. As we had work ready, we'd distribute poems to each other, spend a week reading and commenting on them, and then we'd return to our workshop to discuss it all. The poet would read their work, and then everyone else would talk about its strengths and weaknesses. And then, of course, you were left with a pile of copies of your poem scribbled all over by 10 or so people to then sail the solitary seas of revision while you sorted it all out. Towards the end of my first year, I shared a little poem I had written about my first encounter with a very surprising-looking insect while living abroad. The first draft of that poem went like this. When I said, "What is this?" he said, "Soldadinho," as though it had been a question of translation. A six-legged zebraed helmet, I'd never seen a thing like it. The little soldier dropped from the jackfruit branches, a sentinel on my sunscreen-stained sleeve until the street split. Then it hopped. So, it does what rough drafts do best. It kind of starts to get at the thing that I'm trying to say. And, of course, I ended up with all kinds of comments about every little aspect of this 7-line draft, as you can see. You can even see that someone went to the trouble of drawing the little guy. See, these are the joys of being in a room with a bunch of creatives. If you're ever giving people handwritten feedback, I think drawings are strongly encouraged. But anyway, if you have feedback from multiple sources, the first step is to start looking for patterns. What do you notice that comes through consistently? Remember, good feedback gives you information about how a reader experienced your work. Consistent responses from multiple readers are a good indication of key weaknesses or strengths in your piece. Any one reader could offer up any number of misreadings, but if multiple readers are telling you the same thing, that probably tells you something about your piece. So what did my readers consistently observe about the piece? Well, let's take a look. More than one reader commented on my choice not to capitalize anything, which is apparent from the first word of the title. There was also some consistent confusion about whether the title was just the title or a long first line, but anyway, those comments didn't really offer praise or critique, so much as raise questions about the effects of my choice. My readers wanted to know why I had chosen that particular orthographic route. And between you and me, it's because I was deep in my poetry is an oral art and you can't speak a capital letter so you shouldn't write them either phase. In other poems, I even went so far as to eliminate punctuation altogether. Long story short, That phase didn't last, but I think every poet tries out similar things, at least at some point. Also, a lot of readers helpfully noticed my typo in the title, although my professor, bless the generosity of her reading, did her best to make sense of it as if it were intentional, but nope, I just goofed. Moving on to the first couplet, readers generally liked the description in the first line, with one comment reading, "So whimsical and weird, I love this visual," and more than one of them felt like the second line fell flat when compared to the rest of the poem. One reader said, "This feels like the weakest line in a strong poem, made more noticeable just by how tiny the poem itself is," and the professor, still generous, wrote, "What if this awe and curiosity and foreignness came through in the description itself?" Or I might say, in other words, what if I had done my job as a poet and evoked the sense of strangeness instead of just cupping my hands and shouting, "It was weird looking"? But see, this is what I mean about good feedback. In retrospect, I can look at that line and see that it's weak and lifeless. But my teacher didn't say that. Instead, she gently pushed me to consider how I could get more out of the line. She knew what I was after and wanted me to consider a better way to get it. Oh, and a couple of readers pointed out that they liked the rhymey flavor of helmet like it. The second couplet, though, didn't attract much attention. People generally liked the line break and the jackfruit reference, I'd say thanks to its concrete specificity. One person said it was their favorite couplet, which is not part of a pattern by itself, but just another voice in the generalized acknowledgement that the second couplet seems to mostly be fine. Moving on to the third, then, we get a couple more points of consistency. Readers generally like the sunscreen-stained sleeve. As one reader puts it, great detail here, characterizing speaker as unlike soldier, speaker needing this kind of protection, speaker out of his element, perhaps. But then, almost universally, my readers were confounded by the meaning of the second line, specifically the detail of the street splitting. And my comments were full of questions about whether it was literal or metaphorical, a fork in the road or an ideological divergence. A couple even asked if there were earthquakes in the poem, which, of course, there weren't, but it's a reasonable reading of a line that doesn't do much to lead a reader away from that conclusion. And that's a lot of stuff. In the more discursive comments that everyone wrote on the bottom of the page, some other points of consistency included enthusiasm for the smallness of the poem and an appreciation for the character of the speaker as observant, receptive, or appreciative in the face of a small but wholly new experience. So where does that leave us? On the whole, these points of consistency give me a few things to think about. Hold on to the concrete details and images and revise lines that fall short of that standard of specificity. Maintain and clarify the speaker's emotional response to the experience. Maybe think about my lowercase convictions, and figure out what I mean by the street split. See, so in 10 pages of handwritten comments, by looking for patterns or consistency across those comments, we now have 4 simple points to consider for revision. But of course, not everyone agreed about everything, so the thornier part of working with feedback is figuring out what to do about suggestions that conflict with each other. When your readers are telling you different or contradictory things, what do you do then? And this is where it becomes especially important to have a good handle on what you're trying to accomplish with a piece of writing. Now, it's common not to have a good sense of direction with a first draft. In that case, the things your readers tell you consistently might help to orient you. In this case, I had a pretty good idea, though. I wanted to write about an experience of encountering an insect and trying to figure out whether it was dangerous or not, but then having my question misinterpreted as an effort to learn a language. So the objective is to look for feedback that helps me to accomplish that purpose more effectively. And the consistent responses help to that end. My readers generally got the basic sense of the speaker's response to the whole situation, and they appreciated the concrete details that set up the experience I was trying to recreate. Using those keys, my own purpose and the consistent points in my readers' responses, I was in a better position to make decisions about the conflicting feedback. As I mentioned before, there was some confusion about the title. A handful of readers weren't sure what to do with it. They were wondering whether it was a first line or a title or why it was so much longer than everything else in the piece. On the other hand, one reader wrote, yes, fabulous title, love it. And me too. I love a long discursive title on a poem, so I'm inclined to retain it. But one of the important lessons of writing is recognizing the difference between things that you like and things that actually make the piece work better. As we'll see, this longer title didn't survive, but I do still like it. Another key point of disagreement was in the third couplet. You may have heard the relentless string of S's yourself. Of course, I'm inclined to follow my ear wherever it will lead me, and my readers knew that by then, so the alliteration itself was not a surprise, but the reaction to it in this case was mixed. On the positive side, I had readers say things like, yes, the words and sounds, and let us bow to Andrew, the master of sound. But others had a different response. One wrote, holy lot of S's, Batman. Maybe a few too many. And another said, I'm a little concerned that you've out-Andrewed yourself here, because I found the heavy alliteration distracting. And we'll get to the second draft in a moment, but my thinking goes a little bit like this at this point. I will never write a poem that isn't driven by sound, so eliminating the alliteration is not an option. That said, the third couplet is the only one that is driven by sound to such an extreme degree, and it isn't really the mission of the poem to be a demonstration of alliteration. So the alliteration will probably stay, but it will have to stay in a different form. Enough readers responded to it as overly distracting, and I don't want my verve for sound to work against the larger purpose of the poem. That said, I also love distractions. If a poem can sound so good that it makes me forget what it's about, I'm having a good day. A distracting technique is not inherently a bad technique. And distraction can serve a purpose. But that's the key. Purposeful distraction is useful, but distraction that is at odds with purpose probably needs to be revised. Well, you're far too kind. But really, the real issue here is not the alliteration by itself, but the inconsistency of that third couplet with the rest of the poem. So the choice is either to amplify the sound play elsewhere in the poem, or dial it back in the third couplet, in order to make things more even. The third major point of conflict arises with respect to the final line. A good number of readers liked the way the poem hops off the page. One wrote, M- at its poetic finest, which again tells you about the crowd in the room, but an equal number also expressed interest in seeing what happens after the hop, where the speaker, insect, and other person went from there. On that front, the decision was easy, because a more expansive poem just wasn't what I was after. More readers liked the smallness than didn't, and of the ones who suggested a longer piece, enough of them were uncommitted to the idea that it sounded more like a thing to consider as an option than as something that the piece really needed in order to do its job. And sometimes it really is that easy. If a reader has an idea that just doesn't make sense for what you're trying to accomplish, ignore it. Feedback isn't binding, and sometimes readers misunderstand your purpose. This is normal. So, from the conflicting comments, I found a few more priorities for revision. Consider the title and its relationship with the piece as a whole. Look for ways to establish the context of the moment more clearly so that readers can see what's at stake more intuitively. Reassess the role of sound play. Contain the action of the piece so that readers don't feel like there could or should be more to it. Encapsulate the moment of surprise and misunderstanding so that it's more clearly the heart of the poem. And with those comments under my belt, I had everything I needed to get started on a second draft. And speaking of that second draft, it went like this. When I said, "What is this?" he said, "Soldadinho," as though it had been a question of translation. A six-legged zebraed helmet dropped from the jackfruit branches and perched on my sunscreen-stained sleeve. I watched, trying to decide if it was more ladybug or yellow jacket, when it hopped. So let's account for the changes. The title hasn't gone anywhere because I liked it and my professor liked it, but I largely dispensed with punctuation to match my rejection of capitalization, with just a few pesky remnants. And the form changed as well. Instead of 3 couplets, we've got 2 tercets. I think I was attracted to the 6s because of insect's legs, but anyway, more importantly, the first tercet articulates almost everything that the first draft said by itself, but it does it more efficiently. I've trimmed the less interesting lines, pared back the alliteration, and concentrated the concrete description of the inciting moment. All of these are priorities for my initial round of feedback. Here then, the second tercet does the job of clarifying the human heart of the piece. The experience of intending to ask one question and then getting an answer that is both reasonable and completely beside the point. And still attached to the final M-, I end it at the same point. Now, by now, this was a poem that I was revising under the guidance of my advisor, not an entire cohort of student poets. So I had less feedback to deal with, but also more experienced feedback. And in a case like that, there's less to figure out, but there are still decisions to make. So here's what my advisor had to say about the second draft. The title was still causing some trouble. She pointed out that it could use some clarification. The first tercet was largely okay in her view, but the second one, which is, by the way, all new content, created some issues. The sense of the second line was elusive. I wanted to evoke the sense of trying to map experiences with familiar insects onto my response to this new one, but in this case, the degree of specificity caused some problems because the ladybug and yellowjacket imposed an overly narrow range of interpretations, neither of which really fit the insect in question. In other words, the degree of specificity put too much pressure on the basis for comparison, so I got the suggestion to go more generic. With respect to the piece as a whole, I got the note that my advisor heard a shorter line in the piece, and a question about whether I had considered a syllabic form, which I hadn't. And, for some reason, I wrote Mary Ann Moore in the margin. Who knows why? But at any rate, after receiving that feedback, the third draft ended up looking like this. Membrasis lunata. A six-legged zebraed helmet dropped from the jackfruit branches, perching on the hem of my sunscreen-stained sleeve. What is it? I asked. A curious grazer? An aggressive stinger? But my companion, thinking it only a matter of translation, responded, soldadinho. So what's happened now? Between the comments from my cohort and advisor, I finally decided that the long title that I liked so much was really more trouble than it was worth, that a lot of what it said belonged in the poem itself, and that it was acting more as a barrier than a doorway. So we have a much shorter title. It's just the scientific name of the creature in question, and it's a choice to simplify the title, but also to give readers a specific thing to Google when they don't know what I'm talking about. In the early drafts, enough people had Googled soldadinho and ended up with translations that didn't quite fit the poem, so I wanted to avoid those misinterpretations. And look, now we've got 6-line stanzas because I agreed that shorter lines made more sense, and because I'm still wedded to the idea of sixes. Because bugs, get it? You can see the alliteration is dialed back, but it's also backed up by sound work elsewhere. The line, branches, perching, is held together by rhythm and voiceless affricates, and helmet and hem echo each other from opposite ends of the stanza. I've then moved a good chunk of the title into the second stanza, the question, the confusion, but I've also cleared away the complicating specificity of the ladybug and yellowjacket, replacing them with the underlying intent of the question, not what kind of bug is it, but what degree of threat does it pose, in an effort to clarify the answer the speaker expects, and thereby amplify the misunderstanding implicit in the received answer. And the final line reflects the title, a common name in place of a scientific one. So in this draft, you can see more clearly an effort to dispense with things that I found amusing in order to clarify and amplify the actual effect of the poem. Yes, I liked the long title, and yes, I was a fan of the concluding em-dash hop off the page, but those things pulled readers away from what I was really after. Remember, the goal of revision is not just to make something that you like more, but to make something that does its job more effectively. So know your mission and stick to it. At this point, the comments and revisions are really more about fine-tuning effects than about overhauling the piece. It's much closer to doing its job, so the necessary changes aren't as significant, and that's indicated by the comments that I received from my advisor. We get some high praise for the revised characterization of the insect in the second stanza, and she zaps the ambiguous pronoun near the end appropriately. Then there's a comment about the possibility of layering more languages into the piece, since it is about language, and a possible reading of the piece as evoking the biblical story of Adam having to name the animals after the creation, in both the direct question over naming and the searching through many different kinds of animals to get there. So there are some things to clarify and finalize, which will lead us right into the final version. The Little Soldier. A six-legged zebraed helmet dropped from the jackfruit branches and perched like some forward scout on the hem of my sunscreen-stained sleeve. What is this? I asked, meaning, is it a curious grazer, an aggressive stinger? But my companion, thinking my question only a matter of translation, of names, responded, soldadinho. This is the version of the poem that ended up in my thesis. So why is it the way that it is? Well, of course, it's a product of all the feedback and drafts that I went through in an effort to bring out the poetic heart of the piece. So you'll notice that by the end of my time in poetry school, I had relented on my no capitalization or punctuation stance. We're just doing normal things here. The title pulls from the first draft, offering not the scientific Latin name, but a literal English gloss for the common Portuguese name, which gets reflected once more in the final line. This is really a tone-motivated decision. In a poem that offers a kind of hesitant wonder in the face of a new experience, the playful whimsy of the new title sets a more apt tone than the sterile Latin nomenclature does. Moreover, it sets the tone of the insect's ultimate harmlessness, giving an English reader some sense of the Portuguese, at least as filtered through my perceptions. The new title also revived some of the soldiery imagery from the first draft, pulling in the line comparing the insect to a forward scout, again evoking more of a sense of curiosity than harmfulness. Here we continue the management of tone while still fleshing out the characterization of the creature. And the second stanza offers the speaker's reaction to and commentary on the appearance of this little bug. What is it, which I read as a more neutral information-seeking question, becomes what is this, which has a flavor of greater urgency. Not just, oh, a new thing, but I need to know if this is an okay thing. And then we get a more direct commentary on the misunderstanding and a brief reflection on the nature of language and naming, probably as a reinforcement of my advisor's Adam-related reading, which concludes with the name of the bug. Looking at it now, I think there are other changes that I might make, but that's just the value of letting a poem sit for a few years. The real point, though, is that this poem has come a long way from its original form, and it adopted a few different shapes along the way. Feedback played a vital role in that process because that feedback helped me to identify where my readers' experiences with the piece aligned with and diverged from the experiences that I wanted them to have. Where readers were reporting what I wanted them to report, I knew the piece was succeeding at its purpose. But where readers were reporting on things that conflicted with my purpose for the piece, I knew that that was where changes needed to be made. Well, that's very generous, but focusing on the poem, the first draft was a very raw attempt at figuring out what I had to say about that one time a bug I'd never seen before landed on my sleeve. The second draft, then, was an attempt to cut away the excess and clarify the intent. The third maybe took an overly serious turn in an effort to amplify the effect, and the final draft took the clarification and amplification of the previous drafts and reinfused them with some of the playfulness of the first draft, striking a lighter tone while also dealing more directly with the nature of the experience itself. And with that, it got as close to doing its job as it was going to get, at least during my time in poetry school. Shortly after that, I was solicited for submissions for an anthology that my inexperience couldn't tell was legit or sketchy, so I sent them this one because I wasn't overly attached to it. And now I'm pretty sure it was a predatory publishing thing, but you live and learn. That's a story maybe for another time, but long story short, it's run into a publishing dead end, so I don't feel the least bit bad about reproducing it in all its iterative glory for you now. Good times. Hey, before we quit, I just want to say thanks for watching. It's the kind of thing that can sound trite, but it really does mean a lot. It also means a lot that so many of you have made your way over to the Discord server. It's a great place to give and receive feedback, but it's also just a good time. And, of course, an especially big thanks goes to those of you who are supporting the channel as members. It's really encouraging to see those of you who believe in the project to such an extent, and it's a lot of fun to see all those skulls cropping up in the comments. Truly, thank you. I mean, I guess you're right. The links for all of that stuff are in the description, but I also just want to reaffirm that having you along for the ride in any capacity is support enough. Of course, I appreciate the additional support, but it's not a requirement for being on good terms with the show. It all counts. But anyway, we went through a lot today, and sure, I could have just said that the only thing you have to do when you get feedback is listen to the feedback that helps your work to do its job better and ignore the rest. But knowing what to do and how to do it are two very different things. So I hope this demonstration of my own feedback and revision process was helpful. Whatever you do, remember that the point of revision is to make sure that your writing is doing what it's meant to do, and that the point of feedback is to collect data from readers about whether or not it is doing what it's supposed to do. Feedback is useful insofar as it guides your revision process, but it's also always non-binding. Just because a reader says you need to do something, that doesn't mean you have to do it, so weigh the feedback against your objectives and make the changes that make sense. Don't feel bad about ignoring suggestions, as long as you're ignoring them because they don't fit your project, and not because your ego is too tender. My advisor suggested writing this poem in syllabic verse. I thought about it and then didn't do it, and that's just fine. Now, go find some feedback from helpful people and then figure out what you want to do with it to make your writing as good as it can be. While you do that, I'll hang out here and get ready to see you next week. So, thanks again for joining us today, and we'll catch you in the next one.